Welcome back to Murder in the Black. It is your host, Steph.
And I'm MD.
Let's go ahead and get to our true crime case for today.
So grab your coffee if it's the morning, your lemonade if it's the afternoon, or your wine if it's the evening. But either way, let's get into it. The title of our case is What Would Jesus Do? Turns a Cold Case Hot. It's the murder of Beverly Jackson. Now, what would you do if you held the truth about a horrific crime, but feared that speaking out may just cost you your life? Would you risk everything to seek justice or stay silent to protect yourself? For a young man whom we're going to call John, the choice was tormenting. He wrestled with the question, what would Jesus do? And for years, John had knowledge that could actually crack open an unsolved murder case, a crime so shocking that it devastated an entire community. But speaking up meant breaking a dangerous code, one that warned that snitches get stitches. We talked about this in a previous case. But today we're going to tell the story of Beverly Jackson, a beloved mother and nurse whose life was violently stolen, her moments horrifying beyond comprehension. A case that went cold for 8 long years until one tip shifted everything.
The night of January 14th, 1995 was just like any other night for Beverly Jackson, a 39-year-old pediatric AIDS nurse living in Miami Lakes, Florida. She was scheduled for the graveyard shift, and many of you nurses know exactly what that shift is. God bless you all. Taking care of sick children, something she had devoted her life to doing. Beverly was originally from Jamaica, and she moved to Miami for a better life. She came with her mother and sisters, and she worked hard to earn a living and make a better life for her children. Before heading to work, she stopped at home to visit her oldest daughter, who had a young baby of her own. Beverly cherished being a grandmother, balancing long shifts so she could be home with her family during the day. Her sister Sonia was the last person to see her that night. The two women, both single mothers, leaned on each other as they raised 7 children between themselves. Bless their
God,
hearts.
God bless their whole
And
hearts. And I
talk about
know,
that's
Steph, I know
community
I have
work right
four. I mean,
there.
that's us. But that would be us, right? Like if our husbands passed away and we moved in, we'd have 7 children between us
God.
that we'd have to raise. And so they decided, let's just do this together instead of doing this,
Yeah,
separate.
I admire them. I admire
Same.
them.
Because I don't want to do it.
Yeah, they lived together and managed to work together to take care of each other and the children. As Beverly left, she told Sonia, I need to get gas before work. And with that, she drove off into the dark rain on a rainy Miami night. But Beverly never made it to the hospital. The next morning, while Sonia was at work, she called home to speak to her sister, but Beverly wasn't home. By this point, her family knew something was wrong. They attempted to call Sonia, hoping Sonia knew where Beverly was, but Sonia was busy at work and didn't get any of their calls. Once they spoke with Sonia and they confirmed that she didn't know anything, the family began to panic. They called the morgue, they called every hospital in town, but there was nothing. No sign of Beverly. Fear turned into panic. Her mother called 911 reporting Beverly as a missing person. The response was infuriating. Police said that there was nothing they could do for 72 hours because Beverly was an adult. For 2 agonizing days, her family searched on their own, driving the routes Beverly would normally take, hoping to find something, a sign, a clue, anything. They had no idea that just 2 miles away, Beverly's car was sitting at the bottom of a murky canal.
Now, on January 16, 1995, at 11 a.m., Miami police were called to Wade Waterways after a patrol officer noticed something strange. The roof of a car was sticking out of the water. Now, pulling cars out of canals in Miami was nothing new to police. As a matter of fact, Steph, they say that about 800 cars are pulled from canals in Miami per year. They recover them because most people dump them for insurance fraud. They're not even thinking that this is something that could be menacing, right? At first, officers, as they were pulling the vehicle out of the canal, they weren't alarmed. But then they noticed something unusual. damage to the rear bumper. Then something horrifying, a human leg protruding from the trunk area. They immediately knew that this was not insurance fraud. This was murder.
2 nights earlier, Beverly Jackson left for work and never returned. Now, she had been found, her fully clothed body locked inside the trunk of her car, submerged in water. She still wore her jacket. One sneaker was on, the other had come off in the struggle. At first glance, there was no visible signs of trauma, no bullet wounds, no stab wounds. But when the medical examiner examined Beverly, the truth became very clear. She had water in her lungs, meaning she drowned to death. Deep nail scrapes inside the trunk proved that she fought like hell to escape. She had vaginal lacerations, a sign that she had been sexually assaulted before her death. Beverly drowned in the trunk of her own car, trapped in the dark, suffocating water, clawing for survival. The medical examiner determined that it took her between 6 to 8 minutes for the water to fill her lungs and die. And I add, that has to be one of the most brutal ways to die outside of gun and a knife, some of the more common ways, but to drown to death is terrifying. It's terrifying. 6 to 8 minutes is absolutely terrifying. During this time, Beverly fought with everything she had to get out. And B, can you imagine how long it takes for somebody to drown? 6 minutes. Now, I would do what they usually do in court. It's like, come on, let's do 6 minutes on the clock right now. I ain't gonna do y'all like that, though. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely horrifying. And I know in court, what I would do, right? If I were a prosecutor and I were defending this case, I wouldn't do 6 minutes, Steph. I would just do a minute. Because I don't think that we fully appreciate how long a minute is when you're actively listening and sitting in silence. It feels very long. Like you say a minute, and I say that to my kids all the time. Okay, we're going to get to that in a minute. And you say that because you're like, in a second, real quick, fast. But a minute when you are clawing for survival, while water is filling up your lungs, and you're fighting like hell to get out, a minute feels like eternity. 6 is extraordinary. Detectives needed answers because, let's face it, Beverly's final moments, they're unspeakable. Beverly's sisters told detectives about her fiance because obviously they're looking for anybody that would do this to her. And Beverly's fiance's name was George Walker. They described the relationship as toxic. Of course, in the beginning of most relationships, it's wonderful, right? Things are going great. But at the time of Beverly's death, the relationship was actually in turmoil. So when police questioned George, they're trying to figure out, where were you at the time of this murder? But George actually had an airtight alibi. He was actually out of the state at the time of the murder. They were able to corroborate his alibi, and everything checked out. So they dig a little deeper and they ask more questions. And the sisters tell them, hey, why don't you take a look at her ex-husband, Yulee Stinnett. Yulee and Beverly were actually married in Jamaica, and that they moved to Miami together. They had children together, and they hoped to start a life here in Miami that would be better than the life that they had in Jamaica. But soon after they moved to Miami, physical abuse entered the marriage. And soon later, the marriage ended in divorce. Now, despite the fact that they divorced, they had to still be around each other, right? That's one thing that you have to understand when you have children, is that divorce doesn't end the relationship. It changes it, but it doesn't end it when you have children. because now you got a co-parent. And so Yulee was still around. He was the father of Beverly's children. And as they co-parented in this relationship, Yulee continued to create a toxic environment for Beverly. And so the sisters are like, he kind of may have a motive, because at the time she died, he was still like at odds with her. So detectives take Yulee's DNA, but it doesn't match the rape kit either. See, what's incredible stuff about this particular case, and maybe as a nurse you can speak to this a little better for us as listeners, but when you have a drowning type situation, and also on top of that it's compounded by a rape, water, I guess, like can cause some of that DNA to not be there inside the body the longer that the body is sitting in the body of water. But in this particular case, Beverly had on elastic pants that set pretty tight around her waist. And so that DNA from the rape stayed inside her body because she was in the water for so long, like 2 days before they were able to pull her out. So what do you think about that, Steph?
What's interesting from a scientific background, I think a medical examiner would have a better explanation than me, because what was the total time that she was sitting in the water? The height of the water and the elasticity. I'm thinking she was a nurse, so she more than likely had on scrubs. I'm trying to think, it's 1995. They built clothes different back then. In terms of elasticity, right? Like,
right.
A pair of scrubs right now doesn't have a lot of elasticity. It's only in the waist part. So, I don't know. I don't think that I would have the answer for that. I think a medical examiner will be able to say, based on the elasticity and, the height of the water, and that it was, how many hours she was left there, that they were able to contain the DNA in a more secure setting, and I think that makes sense.
Yeah. And it was interesting because I didn't even think about how the water could cause the DNA. I mean, it makes sense, right? The water could cause the DNA to, I guess, leave the body. I don't know. It just was, when they made a big deal about this, that she had on these elastic pants that preserved the DNA inside her body, they were excited that happened. Well, the medical examiner took the DNA from her body and they submitted it into the criminal database. And that's what they were running, Yulee's DNA against. That's what they ran George Walker's DNA against, and any potential suspects that would come along. That's what they were going to run it against. And Steph, and our true crime listeners know, avid listeners know, that back in 1995, the criminal database, while it was there, it wasn't robust like it is today. And so they didn't get any hits for this case when they submitted it into the database. But the detectives hoped that one day they would be able to find a viable suspect that either would show up in the criminal database or that they would be able to run against this DNA to prove that they were a part of this crime. But weeks passed, then months, then years. And as we know, this case went cold. And not just cold, it went ice cold. There was no leads. There was nothing coming in. And on every year on the anniversary of Beverly's death, the family gathered near the canal and they just begged the media for anybody with any information to come forward. Until finally, 8 years later, someone finally broke that code of silence that existed in this community, and it broke the case wide open.
I want to say, just before we move on, that, it's so important that if you ever, which I hope no one ever finds themselves in a situation like this, but the inevitable, right, of living in a world filled with so much evil. And I think it's important, like the case we had last week, and even this case today. I'm sorry, guys. I'm just a sucker for parallels. But, you really do have to be your family member's advocate. And just them going down to the canal, telling reporters to come down, reminding the community of Beverly's death, was doing way much more than they ever could think to do. And our case last week, her pounding the pavement, asking questions, going into the spaces that detectives couldn't. And so if you ever find yourself in this situation, you really do have to be your family member or your friend's advocate. You have to keep the story in the media's face. And now we have podcasts and all these other good outlets. And so I just want to encourage us all that that's the way to do it. And they did such a beautiful job. Now, the tipster that came forward, his name was John. He was 16 years old when he first heard a confession that would haunt him. John's friend, Dooley Green, bragged about a crime he committed 3 years earlier. He carjacked a woman at gunpoint, forced her into the trunk, and rolled her car into the canal. John was horrified, but stayed silent, fearing for his own life. For years, the truth burned inside him. He couldn't sleep. Everywhere he turned, he saw WWJD. If you know, you know. What would Jesus do?
And this was back in 1995, right, Steph? So like when WWJD was a big phenomena. Everybody was wearing it on their wrists. They had T-shirts. They had hats. Like it was everywhere.
He also saw shirts that would say, with the slogan, "Stay silent." So he was torn between WWJD and the theme of just staying silent, keeping to yourself the information you know. But his spirit wouldn't let him rest. Eventually, he broke down. After thoroughly vetting John, giving him a polygraph, and taking his DNA, they knew that he had information that would break this case wide open. So they arrested Dooley Green and Victor Pastrono, just 15 and 16 at the time of the crime. They were arrested for kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. At first, they denied everything. Then they turned on each other, trying to pin it all on the other person. Finally, they were placed alone in a room together, not realizing they were being recorded. They conspired to blame a third person, someone who was already dead. That was all the detectives needed.
That was definitely all the detectives needed, Steph, because in July 2006, after 8 long years, the case went to trial. Now, armed with John's testimony, DNA evidence, and the video of Dooley and Victor conspiring to blame each other, to blame this crime on a dead person. And mind you, this dead person, Steph, was their sister's ex-boyfriend, and he was dead. And so they were like, oh, we can blame it on him. He can't come back and say he didn't do it. So after gathering all this evidence, the prosecution felt that their case was strong. That is until they couldn't find John. Yeah, John, the one that struggled to come forward, he was nowhere to be found. He refused to testify because he was fearful of what would happen to his own life. Now, the prosecution, they were already headed to trial. So it's not like they can say, okay, judge, we can't find our star witness here. So let's call the case until we can. Like, no, you still got to go. So the prosecution felt like they had no choice but to proceed to trial. And then at the final hour, I'm talking about the night before the beginning of trial, John emerged, and he came with brilliant confidence that conquered his fear and testified even as he received death threats during his testimony. Now, just imagine it, Steph. Like, you're on the stand. It already took, very literally, every single thing in you to come to court. And as you're testifying, someone burst out in the gallery, "I'm going to kill you. You're dead." I mean, that's horrifying.
It is. I think a lot of people don't truly understand what it takes to testify when you don't want to, when you've been subpoenaed, when you quite literally have to. And in John's case and others, somebody could come back and harm me, or more than likely they are. I'm risking my life. So I can't imagine the terrifying nature of what he experienced in that courtroom.
Absolutely. Now, the prosecution built their story really around what Dooley and Victor confessed to, or really Dooley, right? Dooley confessed to John years earlier. And this is what Dooley told John. He said that Beverly was on her way to work. She stopped for gas. We knew that, right? At a local gas station where she was gassing up her car. And that's when Dooley and Victor approached her. They put a gun to her head and they made her get into the car. Now, they promised each other and they promised her that they weren't going to hurt her. So they drive her car to this school abandoned parking lot. And that's when they take turns raping her. So first Victor rapes her. He gets out of the car. Dooley gets in the car. And then Dooley rapes her. Now, the school that they parked at was just 3 blocks from her home. I can only imagine how Beverly was just probably thinking, if I can just manage to get away and run down the street, I can be home. I can be safe. But she was promised that after these men did their business, that they were going to let her go. But we know they didn't let her go. And they surmised that the reason they didn't let her go was what Dooley told John. He told John that the reason they had to kill Beverly was because Victor called Dooley's name. And Dooley doesn't have like a name like Victor. He doesn't have a name like John. Dooley's unique. There's probably only 1 or 2 Dooleys in this whole world. And he knew that she heard him say that name and she would be able to easily identify him. So at that point, they made a decision that they had to get rid of her. They forced her into the trunk of her own car and they made sure that she couldn't get out. They then put her car into reverse, backing intentionally into a tree or a pole to make it seem like there was some sort of an accident. And then they rolled the car, they put the car in neutral and rolled the car into the canal. Now, the medical examiner, he testified that it took anywhere between 6 to 8 minutes for her lungs to fill up with water before she drowned. Now, it's hard to imagine, and we've talked about this already, that someone would have to go through so much agony to try to escape, but the prosecution painted that picture very well for the jury so that they could understand the devastation and the fight that Beverly endured trying to get out. Now, the defense on the other side, they didn't offer up any explanation, much like our previous case last week. They just kind of was like, they didn't do it. It wasn't them. And I think whenever you find defense doing this, it's 1 or 2 things happening here. I think it's either one, that they truly believe that the prosecution did not do their job. The burden of the prosecution, and I've said it here before, is to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. That is not the defense's burden. The defense has no burden in a criminal case. And so when a defense attorney believes that the prosecution has not proved the burden, this very, very high standard, then they can just simply say, hey, we didn't do it. And the prosecution has not shown you here today that they've done it beyond a shadow of a doubt. And that was pretty much what they did. They laid that in front of the jury and they left it to the jury to make the decision. They found these men guilty and they convicted Dooley of 4 life sentences, and Victor received 2 life sentences plus 60 years without the possibility of parole. Now, without John's testimony, this case would have never been solved. But coming forward also came as a cost to John. Since testifying, John's family, his family, and his so-called friends abandoned him. And he's continued to face multiple death threats. He's been forced to move, leave the state, and leave other states that he's lived in. And he says that he lives in constant fear and he feels like he remains stuck in time, in that moment where he decided to come forward and tell the police what happened. Yeah, one of the true crime documentaries is Tamron Hall. And so you can go to Tamron Hall and search for this case. But at the very end, I just thought this was the most touching thing was one of the sisters of Beverly wanted to meet John, right? Because she said that, they watched him testify and they tried to go up to him after the trial, after he testified, but he, got out of there before they could get to him. And again, like, John has moved and they've never been able to get in contact with him and they never were able to thank him. So Tamron Hall, she arranged a way for them to meet up, and the embrace that her sister and John had was gut wrenching. I mean, it literally drew tears to my eyes. And John broke down and cried as soon as Beverly's sister hugged him. And she just thanked him for and just expressed so much gratitude for what he did that day. And you could just see that he was so grateful that someone said that to him, because he paid such a high price. And that's really, Steph, my takeaway and my closing thoughts. I don't even know takeaways. Justice, it comes at a price. And for Beverly's family, John paid that price. And I'm just so grateful that they sought out a way to just express their thanks and their gratitude to him, because in the end, he carries that burden with him. And just shame on his family for abandoning him, for doing the right thing. And kudos to John. And if you are listening, you are the unsung hero of this case, because without John's coming forward, these two killers would have walked free. It took him, John, a brave soul who refused to stay silent in a culture that literally praises silence.
Yes. So if you guys enjoyed this case, make sure you let us know. We always love to hear from you. So you can do that via Spotify, right in the comments, and we can get your comments instant. Also, you can do that on YouTube as well as Instagram. We are looking forward to hearing from you, and we want to know what y'all are doing for the summer. Let us know our vacation plans. I want to know, because I ain't going on one. We will see you guys next week. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black.